Um, we're going to have a translation because this session is going to be in Spanish, okay? I wish, I wish. So we're gonna start with this session related to action on tropospheric ozone. This study that will be presented to us today, and then we're going to have a panel discussion about the action that needs to be taken in order to tackle and move forward in this respect. So my name is Gustavo Alaniz. I am the chair of the Mexican Environmental Law Center in Mexico City, which is a 31-year-old organization in Mexico that has been pushing very much in favor of the rule of law, no, in Mexico, and make sure that the laws and the regulations are put in place and are effectively enforced and are effectively complied. So today, I would like to say just a very few words related to tropospheric ozone. And the first thing, as you know, why we need to tackle is because the contributions that this has not only to global warming but also to climate change, first of all. Second, the impacts, no, that it has on ecosystems, the impacts that has on human health. I've been reading about the premature death. Also, I have seen some information related to respiratory problems that occur. No? So I think that this on itself, it's sufficient to make sure that we tackle tropospheric ozone. Also, we need to take into account that there are some economic impacts, no, related to this. No? There is loss in forest productivities also. No? So it is somehow clear, or very much clear, that it's coming from transportation, including shipping, aviation. It's coming from industry, energy sectors, wildfires, among others. Also, there's a big question that we need to put in the table, and this is how can we better reduce tropospheric ozone? No? And one of the things that we will listen here today is that there's a need for further scientific research. There's more research that needs to be taken, and we will listen also about the case studies that had to do with Mexico City, had to do with LA, had to do with Beijing. And finally, I would like to say that this study, this investigation, this research is very important because it will help for the policy making, no? It will help for the decision-making process on how to move forward. And I think that we will listen about some of the things that need to be done. No? For example, from where are we going to get the resources that we need? What kind of technology do we need to put in place? No? What kind of policies? What kind of laws? What kind of regulations? Etc. etc. So I wanted to give these brief words in introduction. So we're going to start with the first part of this session, and I would like to introduce you. In first place, we're going to have Zitely Tzompa Sosa, who will be doing the presentation of key recommendations from the case for action on tropospheric ozone policy brief. So, Zitely, you have the floor for 10-15 minutes, please. Go ahead.
What about now? Excellent. Thank you, Gustavo. Thank you for this introduction. It's a pleasure for me to be here launching the case for action on tropospheric ozone. I would like, first of all, give thanks to our team from the Clean Air Institute, from Hill Consulting, who worked tirelessly along with the Clean Air Fund team to present today this briefing. I would like also to start giving you 2 seconds, just 2 seconds to think about the following question. And please you don't have to say the word out loud. Just think about it. What do you think when you hear the word ozone? Well, there are no wrong answers at all. It turns out that there are two different types of ozone. The first one is the good one, right? The one that stays on top, that is in the stratosphere. It protects us from the UV rays of the sun. And then there's another one that is the bad one, the one that stays down, and the one that is harming our planet, it's warming it, it's harming human health, and it's also threatening food security globally. And don't worry if you didn't know the difference between the two of them. You're not alone. There are many people that get confused, but I don't. I don't get confused. I actually never done. I was born in Mexico City, when at the time it was considered the most polluted city in the world. I live firsthand the impacts of tropospheric ozone. And for all of us who lived and grew in Mexico City, every time we hear the word ozone, we know nothing good comes afterwards. When I was a child, I remember those days when ozone levels were so high that we couldn't go outside and play in the playgrounds. We were forced to stay in the research time inside our classroom. So imagine a child, how hard is that? I was told the sky was blue, but all I could remember was gray, perpetual gray skies. Fortunately, and you will be reading this in the policy brief, things have improved since then in Mexico City, but not everywhere. Tropospheric ozone levels have greatly increased over the last decades in many regions, from South to East Asia to parts in South America. This is a challenge still. And it turns out that tropospheric ozone has a very short-lived time in and and in this time it stays in it stays in the atmosphere. The ozone molecules are very good. They are super good at trapping heat. So it is estimated that since pre-industrial times, it has warmed our planet about 23 point, sorry, 23, no, 0.23 Celsius. And this is huge when we think that the total net warming is about 1.2 degrees. So just to put it a little bit in perspective. From a public perspective, probably that's what we hear the most about ozone. It causes about 500,000 premature deaths per year, and the associated costs of that health care can amount around to $500 billion per year. So this is huge. It's a huge problem. It's a huge burden for every single country. But ozone impacts don't stop there. There's also it also affects vegetation, causing oxidative stress that results in losses of crop yields up to 26% in sensitive staple crops like rice, maize, and wheat. in which billions of people rely on. So you might be wondering, what can we do with tropospheric ozone? Well, because ozone is not emitted directly into the atmosphere, but rather formed in it. The way we to reduce tropospheric ozone levels is by reducing its precursors, which include methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas, nitrogen oxides, volatile organic carbons, and carbon monoxide. And the good news is that there are strategies for shared emission sources, meaning that a single source can emit various pollutants, and some of them can be ozone precursors, yes, but others can be greenhouse gases or particles. All of them, though, pollute the atmosphere. So by having a multi-pollutant and integrated approach to both climate change and air pollution, we can reduce tropospheric ozone levels while benefiting from the climate and the air quality reduction that come from not only from ozone, but from the other pollutants that are also emitted. So in this policy brief, you will find 4 examples from around the world where, even though different approaches to tackling tropospheric ozone were taken, we show that there are key learnings that will help other regions when addressing this superpollutant. And just to give you a hint of what you're going to find when you read this policy brief, and what those successful mitigation efforts mean, first of all, we have a strong political will where economic, technological, and human resources are allocated to this matter. Second, there is a coordination and cooperation between multiple actors. Third, there's a comprehensive scientific information that comes from local and continuously collected data. And fourth and last, there is regional and local integrated emission inventories that include both greenhouse gases and air quality pollutants. So what does these examples tell us? Well, it tells us a story that tropospheric ozone can be addressed in different realities and that collaboration is key. So here at COP, where international leadership and ambition on climate drives action, is where we want it to be today. We call for tropospheric ozone and other climate superpollutants to be mandated within UNFCCC processes, including embedding in COP decision texts and championing the development and uptake of the 2017 IPCC methodology report on inventory for short-lived climate forcers. We call for all parties to join and deliver on the global methane pledge and to include in their national emission reduction plans or national or NDCs targets related to tropospheric ozone and other superpollutants. We call for tropospheric ozone and air quality standards to be in line with WHO guidelines and interim targets. We need to accelerate the transition to cleaner energy sources and improve energy efficiency. And on the financial side, where there's a gap, we would like that efforts to reduce tropospheric ozone and its precursors should be supported by donor countries, multilateral development banks, and philanthropic foundations through grants and concessional development financing, so that recipient countries that we know a lot of them are on the global south, do not suffer from debt distress. So to end my intervention, I hope that next time that you hear the word ozone, you remember about the superpollutant and the following 4x4 things. First, It is a super pollutant that can be addressed and has been successfully addressed in many places around the world. Second, action is urgent. We can't afford to lose more time. Third, regulations to tackle tropospheric ozones are no regrets policies. Fourth, reducing tropospheric ozone is going to give you 4 wins. First, a win on climate. Second, a public health win. Third, a food security and social win. And fourth and last, all put together will also give you large economic wins. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Zitely. So we're going to move to the next phase of our panel. So I would like to invite the speakers, if they can come to the front, please. So what we're going to do is that I'm going to give the panelists 2 questions. Okay, so you can answer to them. You will have some minutes to do so, and then after I give you the questions and you respond, then we will ask more broad questions to the 3 of you, and then you will have again around 5 or 6 minutes, and then we will come back with the public so they can make any question, any comment, any observation that they would like to put before the panelists, and we can have some interaction between the panelists and the public here. So welcome, Marcelo.
Sorry. Thank you.
Mucho gusto que estés acá. So we're going to start with Jane, if that's okay. Let me open my eyes. So Jane, we have a couple of questions for you. The first is climate and health continues to be a growing area of interest, including at this COP. What opportunities does working on tropospheric ozone provide for accelerating integrated health, clean air, and climate progress? And the second question for you would be, the policy brief sets out a combination of policy, science, and funding recommendations. What role should philanthropies play in advancing research and policy to manage tropospheric ozone and its precursors, especially in developing regions? Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I think Zitely covered this climate and health crossover incredibly well. I'm running the Clean Air Fund, which is a philanthropic foundation working to reduce air pollution, both for climate change reasons and for health reasons. And we started off by working on air pollution, coming at it from a kind of co-emissions point of view. Thank you. So knowing that 2/3 of outdoor air pollution is produced by burning fossil fuels, which obviously also are creating greenhouse gases. If you can bring down pollution very often, you can also be bringing down the greenhouse gases that are emitted alongside. And a lot of the time, the general public, and especially politicians of all different political parties, can be prepared to see reductions in air pollution where they might not be as committed to climate change. Air pollution just happens to be less politicized and less party political. So that's kind of how we came into this space. I think given that we're sitting at the COP and the climate change negotiations, the key thing is, where are air pollutants that are bad for your health also directly harming the climate, because they're the pollutants that should be included in the COP text in the negotiations and be able to access climate finance. And that's things like tropospheric ozone, which we're talking about today, and black carbon. So Zitely very ably told us about how tropospheric ozone has been very much overlooked. It's created 0.23 of a degree of warming that we have already seen, and unless we do something, it's going to create a huge amount more. And yet, unbelievably, even though it's something like 1,000 times per ton as warming as carbon dioxide, it's not included in the UNFCCC convention. Greenhouse gases are referred to, and it is a greenhouse gas, but when the gases are listed, it's not there. So that's kind of mental and needs to be changed, and that's the impact that it has on climate and on health. It's really bad for our respiratory systems. Zitely talked through the numbers, so I won't run over those again, but it's really affecting people's quality of life. We hear about these deaths figures. It's not just about the deaths, it's about all of the people suffering from asthma, the kids in Mexico City in the past unable to go out and have their school break because the air is so bad. In a lot of places, schools get shut because the pollution is so bad, so they're losing out on education, and the productivity losses from that are not even included in these huge economic costs that we hear about. So it's actually not just a triple win for climate and health, it's also, as Zitely said, economic benefits too. And then your second question, you were asking about finance and the role of philanthropy, yes? So, as I said, we're a philanthropic foundation. One of the things that we're doing is tracking funding to air quality overall, and especially this intersection between climate and health funding. And there's been some movement. We know that the World Health Assembly, for example, had a resolution on climate change and how health and climate should be more closely tackled together. We know that super pollutants conversations are coming onto the scene at COP. So there's some institutional movement to in the right direction, but it's not yet reflected in access to finance. There's very, very limited amount. Less than 3% of global climate finance is also being maximized for air pollution reduction. So when you think about the potential co-benefits of climate change and pollution reduction, only 3% of projects are either targeting that or are recognizing that at all. That's a ridiculously small amount. So there's two main calls to action that I would have for donors and for the COP on finance. One is if you're a donor worrying about these accelerating temperatures, working on tropospheric ozone is a way of putting on this emergency brake, like all of the other super pollutants. We need to do it at the same time as bringing down carbon dioxide emissions, but because they're not in the atmosphere for very long, when you start to work on them, they come out of the atmosphere pretty fast, and it's an opportunity to help slam the brakes on right now. And for COP negotiators, this has been pitched as the finance COP, and we had a big finance day. Everybody is talking about the new collective quantified goal, this new climate finance target. At the moment, tropospheric ozone projects are not going to be able to access that because it's not a recognized greenhouse gas, but it's not recognized in the same way. There at the moment is no way in the NDCs, even if you can include it voluntarily in your NDC, it's the precursors that you need to include, and you need targets on those. So a call to action as well for including that in the NDCs. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jane. Jen, as she said, represents the Clean Air Fund. Now I would like to move with Marcelo. Is that okay? Marcelo Mena, he represents the Global Methane Hub. And I would like to pose a couple of questions, Marcelo, for you. The first would be, the movement you catalyzed behind action on methane has been just fantastic. What can we learn from this for tropospheric ozone and other super pollutants? And do you think it's possible to do something similar for something as complex as tropospheric ozone, or do we need to take a different approach? The second question would be, let's consider some solutions. What are the most effective climate mitigation strategies to target tropospheric ozone via methane as well as its other precursors, and how can they be scaled globally? Thank you, Marcelo, for being here with us.
Thank you. So globally, the contribution to ozone from methane is significant, but it's not as local, right? So it's not that you reduce methane, you have because it requires more time. The effectiveness of forming ozone from methane is not as high as you would expect. It's more like a global issue, but I think we need to tackle it in any case. There's this report says 1 million people associated to mortality associated to ozone, but also around half of that is from methane, which is really important to consider. But the other thing that we should consider is that methane does not come alone. Methane is emitted with other pollutants, which are really major ozone precursors. So when you look at the emissions from oil and gas well, you will have benzene and toluene and xylene, which are all very potent precursors to ozone. So I think, when you're talking about, first off, reducing fossil fuel use, you have a really big impact. But also, if you're plugging those wells or preventing venting and burning, I think these things are going to be things that bring benefits in ozone formation overall. And so, why do I say that? Because obviously then methane mitigation is ozone mitigation. And so there's no reason why we shouldn't consider that these go hand in hand. And that's why in many ways the Clean Air Fund and the Methane Hub work together. This is one of the spaces in which the reduction of methane and VOCs go hand in hand together. So I don't think there's a lot of things that we need to be doing differently, but we do need to bring up the other half of the warming in the negotiations. We can't not be blind about this. And really, many times the negotiators ask themselves, how do we get more people to support developing countries to join the fight against climate change? Because many believe that they are not part of the problem, and therefore they have no mandate to reduce emissions because it was caused by somebody else's emissions. In the case of methane, this is a different story. In the case of short-lived climate pollutants, it's a different story because the benefits stay where action is taken, and so therefore it really cuts across that narrative and really is the Global South's contribution to mitigation through development, through cleaner transportation mechanisms, through better food production, better energy security. So I think those are things that we should bear in mind. So the way to do it within the context in the short term, I would say, well, first off, reduce fossil fuel use is the biggest thing. And also, we can't pick and choose things. Many times we think we could choose, because I worked on ozone during my PhD, and studied Mexico City's pollution, and many times it's like, well, this city has a lot of NOx, and so VOCs are limiting, and this time, so like as if we could choose. We need to reduce all NO2, NO2. We need to reduce VOC. We need to reduce carbon monoxide, particulate matter. It has to be black carbon. It has to be sulfate. It has to be organic carbon. We don't pick and choose that way. It's absurd that we're sort of optimizing things that will all save people's lives. I really think, it's a little bit annoying because I've been working on aerosol science all my life, and so as to say, we can't reduce carbon dioxide emissions from coal because it will unmask the cooling. But that cooling comes at the cost of people's lungs and air pollution. So I just don't know in which world we could pick and choose, and we really need to reduce anything that hurts people's health, because that should be the first motivation of us wanting to reduce climate change and air pollution overall. Anyways, that's my response.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcelo, for your responses. And now I would like to move to Jonathan Mock. Is that correct?
Frame the issues, shine the light on how important ozone is for climate. So I think another issue on the complexity that comes up is kind of how do you prioritize? And so governments are, yes, we want to reduce everything, but we also want to try and often have limited resources, and we need to figure out how to reduce things effectively, and we want to develop a plan. Governments like plans. If they don't have plans, it's often kind of a much more scattershot approach. right now, the tools just aren't easily available for most countries to develop an ozone action plan. For most countries, they would say, okay, we want to reduce ozone. Well, what would we do? And it would be, well, methane probably, but maybe something on CO or VOCs or NOx, but it's very difficult to tell. And there's also these complex chemistry feedbacks on ozone, where if you do reduce the wrong thing in certain situations, you can make your air pollution problem worse. And so obviously you don't want to do that. But that means that it can be kind of a paralysis situation. And if we're, as the US State Department, in addition to trying to do these type of negotiations, we also have robust technical assistance and programs to help other countries reduce air pollution and reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. But even for us, if we want to partner with particular countries on ozone, the question quickly becomes, well, what do we partner with them on? How can we help? And no one knows the answer to this question. These are answerable questions now. I think what's really exciting and interesting about this, about ozone, is that we now have the modeling tools and capabilities have advanced really dramatically in the last 10 years, but it hasn't really caught up with the policy space yet. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for kind of new science activities to develop these simple tools that can then really help governments kind of move forward with this in ways that will be, I hope, pretty catalytic. This kind of gets into the second question that I was asked about, kind of what opportunities does the US see in inserting tropospheric ozone into climate, and how can we unlock the potential? And I do think it starts with the science. I think that there's, of course, the general call that we should reduce all of these, but in terms of how to really spur targeted, concrete action, I think there's a couple of paths in. So one, of course, is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And they are doing their next assessment report. That will be, there's a scoping meeting on that where they will discuss what should be in these reports. That happens in December. Then governments will meet in kind of end of February, March to discuss and try to negotiate and finalize and think about how the next IPCC cycle will happen. This next cycle is going to look at the next generation of ozone science. One thing that I think will be really important is in the last version of the IPCC, carbon monoxide and VOCs were grouped together. Breaking those apart and even having speciated versions of VOCs in IPCC would be really helpful for governments. Because again, even though, yes, the answer is ultimately reduce everything, governments want to know what should we be focusing on first? How do we develop a strategy? So from the IPCC, there's then this process under the Paris Agreement called the global stocktake. And so the global stocktake was the main headline decision last year, which is where there was the call for next round of NDCs to include all greenhouse gases. And that is really, the global stocktake is supposed to be a process where parties come together, evaluate progress, and think about where we are, where it looks like we're going, and how we should course correct. And so if we want the next type of global stocktake, a decision to have some reference to ozone, that can happen, but there's a process. And so the process would be the IPCC. It would be, there's a lot of technical hearings and discussions that parties have. NGOs, observers are allowed to participate in those discussions and make submissions. The IPCC science is really a guiding part of the global stocktake, but there are other avenues. And then having that, parties can reflect and think about ozone and other issues, say, oh, this is really important, but also now we have the tools to do this. And so from that, parties could then negotiate and then say in the next global stocktake, there could be some sentence or something about noting ozone is an issue and that parties should look at it. I think another exciting and interesting thing that was mentioned on this in terms of how to insert action on this at the kind of government level is this IPCC short-lived climate forces methodology report, which is set to be released in 2027. And that will have guidelines for emissions of CO, for emissions of NMVOCs, and for emissions of NOx that can really help countries take action on these gases that they hadn't been taking before. And so for us, yes, the answer is ultimately reduce everything, but we're excited about expanding the sphere of climate action. We're getting closer and closer to 1.5 as the WMO released their State of the Climate Update report I think recently, maybe it was last week, and saying this is the warmest decade on record, likely to be the warmest year on record. One of the interesting questions for me and for kind of the US perspective on ozone is, are there kind of mitigation opportunities there that we haven't been looking at in the climate fight? in that we're already looking at methane, which is really kind of key and extremely important, but there hasn't been as much attention on these other ozone precursors. And are there opportunities there that maybe aren't covered in climate mitigation actions now and could maybe help us reduce peak warming and limit overshoot in a way that we haven't been thinking about? So with that, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jonathan, for your responses to the questions. Now I would like to move to the second part of the panel, which is to make 3 or 4 questions to the panelists so you can elaborate on them. We will have around 20-25 minutes for this session. And then for the last part, for the third part of the session, we will move to the public. So you can make your questions, your comments, any observation that you would like to put before the panelists. So the questions that I have for you are the following. The first one is, what decisions should the COP take to ensure that this problem is considered in the NDCs and the agenda of the Paris Agreement? The second, what do you think we can deliver on super pollutants at COP30, and how does tropospheric ozone fit into this? The third one, many of the solutions and policy asked within the report are for governments, but what support do you think other decision makers, especially looking at science and research, need in order to implement them effectively? And the last one is, if you had 30 seconds to give a call to action on the super pollutants such as methane, black carbon, and tropospheric ozone, which are critical for global warming and human health, how would you make it? So I would like to leave the floor open for any of you who would like to start. Please go ahead.
I could do 1 and 2, which was what decisions should the COP take now, and what do we hope for at COP30? So we've got quite a few of them, but to summarize, I think name these super pollutants in the text, I think is number 1. As we've said, greenhouse gases are named, ozone isn't in there. So that would be a spotlight role that's playing climate change and embed it in the process. And it would also build on COP28 text, because at COP28, the major win for super pollutants was that non-CO2 emissions was a phrase in there for the first time. And the presidency here and the presidency in Brazil, as part of this troika, are keen to build on what came before. So that would be a good step. Cool.
Up so transmitter. Move your hand up.
Oh.
The transmitter is that.
Thanks. Secondly, include them in tropospheric ozone into enhanced NDCs with a reduction target also, so including the precursors and a reduction target. And then thirdly, allow tropospheric ozone projects to access climate finance. I think what might we expect more from the next COP? Well, what was promising at this one was this non-CO2 emissions summit. Unfortunately, it ended up being called non-CO2 gases, which excluded black carbon. So hopefully next time all super pollutants can be included. But there was this promising step of kind of political buy-in. And we also saw for the very first time on tropospheric ozone, the private sector is starting to measure it. So IKEA, Maersk, the shipping company, and one other, I think it was Halion, they're the first multinational companies starting to measure tropospheric ozone. So there's some momentum coming from the private sector too. So I believe that in COP30 we could quickly accelerate this into a super pollutant declaration. For the exact reasons that Marcelo was saying, these things need to be tackled all together, and also there's no time to pick them off one by one, notwithstanding the governments want to know what the priority is. Taking a super pollutant protocol or declaration into COP30 is something we want to work on. And the Clean Air Fund, Clean Air Task Force, Clean Air Institute Hill, and many of the others working on this topic are for that reason going to convene anyone interested in tropospheric ozone to find out exactly what you're working on, what gaps you think need to be filled, and what we could do to work up to COP30. So please come hand me your card or one of my colleagues at the end if there's any specific ideas you have on that. Thanks.
Should I just try the funding, and then maybe get into the science? So I think, well, the important thing now, just for support, is I believe that we got a huge gap on measurement of air pollution, right, and regulations too. So WHO standards not adopted by anybody at this stage, and ozone regulations are very limited. So if you look at the map of WHO standards, there's not a lot of countries that have ozone regulations. So typically the story is, you buy your PM 2.5 monitor, you got a little bit more funding, you buy your CO and ozone monitor, and then a little bit more VOC, but not unspeciated. And therefore, you really, to do the US approach, you have to have a much more rigorous VOC speciation. And so therefore, there's a big gap from that. And therefore, the amount of countries that have ozone regulations is very limited, and the amount of awareness of this problem is even more limited too. So I would say the important first step would be to acknowledge that there's a problem. There's no countries that are going to have pollution attainment programs on ozone if they don't know that there's an issue, and it's very probable that any city that has similar, high temperature and of some size, there will be a big problem, as we've seen in Mexico City and LA and the places that have been the most leading regions in which ozone has been addressed. So that's the first thing, because if you don't recognize there's an issue, it's going to be very difficult. But in terms of what we should be doing in the different processes, is recognize that if we don't have a separated gas or non-gas declaration of what we're doing on NDCs, we have no way of knowing whether the 1.5 will be met or not, because the timing of the effect will not be known, right? So therefore, and we do know also that non-CO2 pollutants account for near half of the warming, and currently available technologies allow us to reduce temperature around 0.5 degrees by 2050, which is faster than any other solution by itself. Ultimately, I just wanted to say with clarity that all of these super pollutants, with the exception of HFCs, will be reduced with fossil fuel phase out and electrification overall. So it is in many ways the silver bullet of no NO2, no VOC, no carbon monoxide, no particulate matter, no black carbon. So while it might be more complicated in theory, e-mobility hits all those. When you have clean cooking, hits all those. Clean heating hits all those at once. So that's why I believe that the pick and choose methodology could have worked in when you had trade-offs like diesel versus gasoline or wood versus pellets. But here you have one solution which is very clear, which is electrification. Seems to be one that helps hit all. Next Monday we'll have a launch of a report on Health Day of our new research that we funded with Stanford University and many universities in Latin America that replicate the indoor air quality benefits of electrification. And if we were to expand that, and by the way, by no surprise, it is like having a smoker in home when you have a natural gas stove burning in your house, as you would expect burning anything in a home with no ventilation. And so therefore you'll find the benefits of that, electrification in transportation and heating overall. And if we don't do this at once, we start doing and providing and supporting false solutions like diesel, which actually I think is probably one of the biggest environmental flaws we've ever had, in which we were promoting low emissions transportation, yet it came at a cost of air pollution in European cities. Whereas in the US, that didn't support that, you got way better clean air. And supporting wood burning. When at COP29, I was appalled by seeing wood burning being such a big solution, black carbon and soot being promoted, and we have solutions at hand that's much cleaner electrification. And since we didn't consider the black carbon and the methane, we thought it was carbon neutral. We hoped it was carbon neutral because it really isn't anywhere, right? Because nobody's planting those things, those trees back, and many places this is collected from native forests and causing deforestation. So if we had considered black carbon from the very beginning, we wouldn't have supported these false solutions that came at the cost of millions of lives because of those choices.
I guess I'll try to go now. So I guess the questions, the first one that you mentioned was what decisions should COP take? So I kind of got into that before on the global stock take. Because of that, I do think, and reiterate, the IPCC is really the kind of key here for the global stock take. And so that's one thing that there's not going to be any decision or mention of ozone in the global stock take if it's not highlighted in the IPCC appropriately. I think I feel pretty safe in saying that, but I mean, we'll never know. It depends on the negotiations, obviously. But another one that does exist is there's something under the under what's called the SUBSTA, which is a subsidiary body for science and technology. Anyway, that of this process, and what they have is a negotiations item called research and systematic observations. And so every June in Bonn, Germany, they have what's called a research dialogue presentation, where scientists from around the world come and present some of the latest climate information. I remember a couple years ago there was a presentation about methane, and then the negotiators in the room kind of think about the science that they heard and reflect, and kind of try to come to consensus or not on some of the key messages of what we learned. And so that's another opportunity for kind of how the COP could highlight superpollutants, as if there were scientists who come to talk about superpollutants or talk about ozone there, and then the room would think about it and reflect. And sometimes we come to consensus on key messages, sometimes we do not. But that is one opportunity. On what what can be delivered at COP30 next year. I think I'd echo the excitement about the private sector announcements on NMVOC reporting. And that's really exciting, and especially putting that into the climate frame a little bit, because a lot of these companies have very robust kind of climate priorities and decarbonization plans. But I don't think they've thought very hard about kind of non-CO2 greenhouse gases or the effects of their decarbonization plans on ozone precursors. And so being able to highlight that, as we were at the US, China, Azerbaijan non-CO2 greenhouse gases summit, was very exciting for us, because we think it shines some attention on this and can be a signal to other companies that you actually can have climate benefits from these things, and those should be and could be included in your ESG goals, in your plans, in your decarbonization plans. And it can be an additional climate benefit that maybe you didn't know what you were doing, maybe you didn't even know existed, and a way to highlight. And so a way to drive action on these. And I think in particular, my comment before on what are the kind of unaddressed areas of greenhouse gases, one is probably industrial VOC emissions and kind of corporate, which is basically company reporting on these. So having that extended, I think, is a really interesting area, and trying to take action on kind of maybe missing mitigation areas that we could access. Another thing for next year, and this was also announced at the US-China non-CO2 greenhouse gases summit, is the Climate and Clean Air Coalition announced that they are going to kind of begin some work and look at tropospheric ozone. And so the Climate and Clean Air Coalition has done some great and catalytic work on the global methane assessment, which really helped catalyze the global methane pledge. And so we're excited about them, to the CCAC, as they're called, to be doing work on ozone, because we think that could also be similarly catalytic for this area. Lastly, it was, I think, what do you think other decision makers, especially looking at science, can support? So how can we, and what is the policy for science, so to say? And I think that this is an area where the policymakers need to get informed enough to start asking the right questions. Because there's often the science policy, people who make science policy, they want to be responsive to governments. But if governments don't know about this issue at all, the governments aren't going to be asking the questions. So I think this type of event, this policy brief, the attention that's starting to get shined on this, can really start off as a cycle, which will be very kind of catalytic and helpful, where governments know enough to start asking questions, say, hey, what should we be doing on this? And that can get domestic science agencies interested in this, and have more studies and work that's done on it, which can then again lead to more action, help with the IPCC process as well. And so I think that's really, for me, the answer to that question. A little bit more of awareness, and then a little more connection between the science, people who do the science funding, to realize this is an issue and start that process.
Any other? No.
Thank you so much. I just want to add something really quickly because you were talking about the science behind. Sorry, thank you. So to making this policy brief, we were very grateful and for having also the opportunity to work with the tropospheric ozone assessment report TOR, and it's a consortium, let's say, of scientists, and they were able to have recommendations for us. They were participating, and we greatly appreciate the support because we exactly wanted that. We wanted to be that bridge between the science and the policy making. So in this we with this policy brief, that's exactly what we wanted. We wanted to bring down this complexity that you were referring to at the beginning to a very easy way to understand it, and just to have a, a set of guidelines of what you need to do, what has been working elsewhere, and so that people around the world, policymakers around the world, have a clear idea of what are those strategies that can be done and that had been successful elsewhere. So thank you.
Thank you, Zitely, for your words. And actually, I was going to invite you to, if you can join us, please, because since she presented the policy brief, no, in the beginning of this session, I wanted to invite you so you can be with the panelists now for the last part of the session, which is the interaction between the panelists and the public here. So we would like to invite any of you to make, as I said before, any comment, any question, any observation want to put forward. Please feel free to ask for the mic, and more than willing.
Hi, thank you so much. Yes, my name is Monica. I represent Mexico Climate Initiative. And I'm not so much of a technical person, but I did work at the Mario Molina Center. And I suffered the same sort of childhood memories. I remember not being able to go. But what was worrying, and we were discussing this yesterday, particularly with Norway, which is when regulations change or the way of measuring certain gases change, who's the police? Is it the IPCC? Is it the public pressure? How do you regulate? How do you make sure? I know in terms of Mexico, the new government came in, and Dr. Rodolfo Lassi, who was telling me as well that the specific stations where you measure have stopped measuring specific gases, but they keep reporting it as, so we have less contingencias. How do you say this? Contingencies. But people think that it's because the situation is getting better, but it's just because it's not being measured, but it's also not being picked up by governments or by the journalists. So I'm just wondering who's gonna police this process. I don't know, just, you know.
I mean, I just say,
If I may just compliment Marcelo, I wanted to ask if you believe that governments are really aware of what are we talking about, because when you have these kind of situations, it's like, no, you diminish, you let it go, but things are getting worse. So
yeah, so I think like things like citizen science networks are very useful, and I you know, for those who haven't followed, the nearly half of the air quality measurements in Latin America are in Mexico and Chile, and we always got hit because we always on top of the rankings, and I assume Mexico too. But it's not because we had worse air; it's just we had better measurement. So I think it's important. But then having transparency frameworks is really important in that too. I remember when, inspired by the American Lung Association's report on the worst locations in the world, I tried to do the same thing in Chile, and many articles came out regarding how the government was ignoring PM 2.5 measurements, and that really spurred a lot of pressure. And then we were able, when we came into government, to do all those pollution attainment programs that were overdue. The problem is that new governments thought it was done, but it's not done until we have new regulations. And of course, you need to update the regulations, otherwise you start falling back on things. So in the updated PM 2.5 standard, we almost have no bad air days, but we need to update again and bring it back into the forefront. Because when we came into government, there were only 2 bad air days. With the new adoption, it was 90. Very hard, very the fake news. Now the news would not say that it was a new standard, but basically trying to present that it was a failure. But what was really disheartening is that we really cared about it. When we left, nobody cared about it, and nobody came from civil society. But unless the information is available, there's nothing that anybody could go on. So I think transparency frameworks, the Escazú agreement with Latin America on transparency is a very important thing, because that, if the information is out there, then people could take action. And this will happen now with the Trump administration, because we'll have monitoring like the Carbon Mapper Coalition that will allow people to see the emissions anyway and take action locally, even though the national government won't.
Thanks. Yeah, just to add a couple of things. One, with the private sector emissions, this is why it's so exciting that 3 of them have started doing it voluntarily. It's become mandatory for large companies to report on their air pollution footprint in India for the first time in 2023. And it will be, and their compliance of the top 1,000 companies has not been great this year, but it will improve year on year. And in Europe, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive includes air pollution for the first time, subject to a materiality assessment. But if it's material, the top 12,500 companies in Europe will also have to do it. So that will be a way, and audits of the compliance against that will be a way of holding the private sector to account. And the second thing, to build on what Marcelo was saying about transparency, is one thing that our Common Air Commission has noted with regards to air quality is that there just is no single place for countries to report. So countries are reporting city air quality emissions to the World Health Organization, but there's no year in which you have to do it. So actually, you can't. If you draw a graph of air pollution in cities drawn from the WHO data, some of them are like 20 years apart. The years from which the data is drawn, and there's like 8 or 9 different sources of this, some of which are official because they've been submitted by governments, some of which are more up to date and accurate but not official, and so can they be used to hold people to account? Not really. UNEP has done a great study a couple of years ago on which countries have got air quality standards and when they were last updated, to Marcelo's point about people are meeting their own targets but only because they're old ones. But that was a one-off report, which could, if that was repeatable, then that at least could hold governments to account for having the right laws and standards in place.
Yeah, I would like to add one more extra point is it's not a police, but it's a double check. And universities do that, scientists do that. TOR and other consortiums of researchers, they do take a lot of measurements. Field campaigns are also done in different places, and that's another way. Just reach out to the science community. Governments should also reach out. It's both ways, right? Like, we are trying to inform the governments, but the governments also it would be good that they approach the science community for that.
Not working. This. Okay, hi, I'm Martina. Also, I'm heading the Climate and Clean Air Coalition that was mentioned already. Maybe a quick reaction to what Jane just said, because obviously we're within UNEP, and UNEP is planning to do this tracker on a regular basis. So the policy tracker will be done. So it's a piece of good news that will help for sure. Quick reactions. The CCAC had tropospheric ozone in the mix of the short-lived climate pollutants since the beginning, and then we took things bit by bit, and obviously, as was mentioned already with the global methane assessment, that was really a foundational piece to help drive the political ambition. But what made it really successful was not only that we had the the modeling and thereby the data to get out why is it a must do, but we also had a way to point to the solution. So it's also a can do, and that obviously makes it easier for the policymakers, and that coupled with the modeling that would tell us the multiple benefits. And that obviously for tropospheric ozone is slightly more complex. That's why we talk about, well, let's start with the process on this, how we get the materials together. So it's not as easy. Tropospheric ozone is not emitted, it's formed in the atmosphere, and the local context matters. So yes, we know the precursors, but it's not even, I asked at the beginning, oh, so are we good enough? If we reduce methane big time, then that should solve it because it can't form. Not quite. Not quite. That doesn't work. I was like, oh, but if we make the argument, you reduce the methane and you reduce your air pollution and you have immediately your benefits locally, well, not all of that is immediately a local benefit for example, the agricultural production. So all my typical arguments that work didn't quite work. And that's why I think we need to dissect the whole thing. And if the methane action is our sledgehammer to so not only the emergency brake, but here now another term, the sledgehammer to really get down the emissions. Here for tropospheric ozone, it's a scalpel approach because we really need to scratch the surface and we need to look where we are. So local context matters. The stuff obviously is regionally really relevant as well because things travel. So we need the regional cooperation that we need to trigger and then think global with how can we actually factor that in. So I think there's a process out there, and I just invite everybody to be part this is a community that needs to grow, just like the methane community has grown. And whoever is interested, wants to join, we'll need to figure out what to do because we've been asked by the board. We'll see. And obviously we'll build on the cooperation already with this brief and so on, taking it forward. And the last bit, the IPCC methodology on the short-lived climate forcers, super important. We've submitted 25 experts to the list of people whom we hope will be accepted to actually really have a point there. But we had big discussions whether PM 2.5 would be its own category. And it was so sad because we really had to fight for it, but we got a point further. So step by step, I'd say. But I think it only works if the community holds together on this. And so thank you for really putting the spotlight on it. Thanks.
Thank you. Can I get the mic?
Yes.
Thank you. So if there's any reaction from our panelists, please feel free to make any comment, any response, please. Okay. Yes, please.
I have a reaction to Martina. She just mentioned. You just mentioned about the importance of organizing community to raise this non-CO2 reduction, greenhouse reduction actions. Just 2 hours ago, some of the Asian NGO have gathered to discuss how to raise this non-CO2 at more in a national context because each of Asian country or in the world have different approaches and understanding about non-CO2 per type of non-CO2 gases. For example, it is very difficult gather the data of the non-CO2 at industrial level because there is certain maybe data at national level for methane or CO2, but when it comes to HFC or ozone or N2O, it's almost impossible to really get a full understanding of the data. There was the first biggest challenge to address this issue to the public in our society. There was the challenges that our NGOs have faced at first. Secondly, also there is very few awareness among the policymakers in Asia, especially policymakers not that much interested in this topic so far, even though there was very important topic raised in this COP29. So that I really want to ask you, Martina, as CCAC, to urge Asian government to have more attention on this issue. That's my kind of ask. Yeah. So anyway, I think that's very important to organize sort of regular meetings to discuss this no CO2 issue. To compare the different national contexts, I think that's our first step, and maybe the second step can be discussed by our community. Thank you.
I have the mic, please. Thank you. Is there any question, any comment additional that you would like to make?
So one problem, and I think we detected it with Jane when she launched the Alliance for Clean Air 3 years ago at COP26, was that many times we as policymakers, we make the mistake of not having our own internal team speak. One of the complaints was the companies report PM 2.5 and other local pollutant emissions much before they did for carbon dioxide and others to one unit with one methodology, and then they would go to another unit that they don't speak to each other. I myself tried to blend the air quality and climate change divisions into one, but it was probably impossible, because one is thinking long term, the other one's short term. But I do think that is the challenge. It's absurd that we actually request companies to report in those terms, right? It's the same assets, same locations. Why can't you just add one other column that says PM 2.5, VOC, and NOx? But we don't, right? And so then even there's some units, and I would say even the EPA, our ministry certainly had it, different inventories for the same thing. So you would have, PM 2.5 emissions were declared by one unit, but the enforcement unit was using another methodology that was completely different. So I do think that we need to make it easy. We can't expect companies to do things that if we don't get our own things in order.
Just to flag though, there is the Stockholm Environment Institute has started design companies that help them do that sort of.
Can you hear? No. Can you?
No, I think
Marcelo?
yeah, Stockholm
Marcelo,
Environment
le prestas el micrófono.
Sorry, I didn't know I had it. Sorry. I can't see.
Stockholm Environment Institute has done an amazing guide for the private sector on how to report, and they've done it in conjunction with 10 multinational companies that now have started to report in their annual reports. IKEA is the main one that has pioneered it. So, and it does exactly what you said, basically. And that is the point of this new EU and Indian regulation. Have everything all in one place, make sure it's transparent in companies, and your reporting so the board gets to see it and their investors get to see it as well. So if anyone is looking to advise the private sector, I would encourage you to take a look at that guidance. What we're attempting with that group of companies is to ensure that, unlike with climate change, where there's been this proliferation of different reporting standards for companies, that now there's a big bona fide consolidate to avoid that with air quality and to make sure that there's one for all sectors of the data. It's comprehensive, it's aligned with climate reporting, so it does not add a huge amount of extra burden, it just adds a huge amount of extra information.
And thanks. And I can say one thing that's great about the IPCC methodology report coming up is it is connected and integrated. So all right. Anyway, it's been a long day. I also do the negotiations. So basically, it's what's called a supplemental report. So it's not going to be required. You asked also earlier relating to your question, who's going to be the police? There's not really a global police on this stuff. There is the way that the IPCC is also going to work is it works by consensus. And so it's going to work by consensus on what's voluntary guidelines as well. So then the Paris Agreement process would need to separately say, we suggest that people use this or not. So it's not like there's any guide, even if once the IPCC guidelines are out, they have no status in the Paris Agreement process. There would need to be a separate thing that happens. But in and of themselves, the IPCC guidelines will be designed to be kind of easily amendable attachable for the short-lived climate pollutants to what you're already doing. And so the way that it works is basically there will be kind of additional equations and things that you add on to what you're already doing. So let's say you've already calculated the CO2 emissions from your coal plants. In theory, the way that it's supposed to work is there'll be another number that the IPCC will provide you, another kind of methodology to say, okay, you've now determined the total amount of coal that you have burned. And you use equation A for CO2, and equation B for SO2, and equation C for VOCs, or something like that. So it should be very easy to kind of depend on these other kind of emissions in a way that doesn't kind of bifurcate them so you have different processes. And so that's what's very exciting about this ability to have an integrated climate and clean air reporting system that will be in this process. We've often referred to the IPCC as the best available science because it does have this government buy-in, which is one of the things that makes things like the IPCC powerful. Is it's kind of institutionally validated by the governments who have agreed to it. And so in the process, you don't really have to debate on the science so much because that's already taken care of. We send our best scientists to the area. They all debate, the scientists debate, and then the negotiators say, well, the IPCC agreed to this, and then our negotiators who are talking in the IPCC also agreed to this, and so therefore we'll take it. And so that's kind of how it works on getting that through. But again, it'll be easy for countries that are already doing the reporting process. There are 3 different levels in the guidelines. So there's one that's called the Tier 1 methodology, which is supposed to be kind of the easiest and applicable to pretty much all countries, even with low capacity and low information. And so once you're able to start measuring this, even if it's not great, if it's a bare bones level, you get some information, you're able to take some action, and you can start gathering more data, start having a better sense of what's happening, and kind of move up the tiers to do kind of more advanced reporting and more advanced targeting of your emissions.
Somebody else would like to make any other comment, any other observation? I would like to say one thing, Marcelo, because you were talking about transparency. Am I correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I don't know if this has to do something with, for example, access to information, no? Like what was comment here about the measurements being done or not, or if they are done properly or not, etc. No, but besides all the challenges that we have now related to tropospheric ozone, you have to take into account that there are other problems aside. For example, in Mexico, now they want to disappear the national, Institute for Access to Information. It's going to be disappeared by the new government, no? Because they believe that there's a duplication between that institute and what the government does. So now, if we want to get the information, we will have to go to the government and not to an independent body, no? So how do citizens, no, will be able to really have information that is reliable, no, that can give us the real situation about the quality of the air, if the measurements are being done, if they are done properly or not, etc. No, so besides the problem itself, we have problems along. No, so how do citizens would be able to really get to know, for example, health situation, no? Which I believe is something that sometimes we're not taking into account. No.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I do think that this transparency is very important. And for example, if you open up today the Air Visual app here in Baku, you'll see that it will be the U.S. Embassy as a PM 2.5 measurement and anonymous contributors that have helped this. So I do want to say that there's so much value in that. If you open up those maps, you can see that in Africa, limitation of measurements. In Brazil, in the Amazon region, almost no measurements, but you can see the big aerosol from space. So I do think that there's a lot of things that we could do as a community, a philanthropic community, to contribute to that. Because, these are cheap solutions. I got to say, the recent project that we did, funded by CIF at my university, we were able to put 150 monitors in nationally, and it was like very nice project because we did it during the pandemic, and we just shipped them out during the pandemic, and they just arrived, and we have many in Monterrey, many in Lima. The only measurements in PM 2.5 in Buenos Aires at all which is absolutely ridiculous for a city of 20 million people. The Montevideo didn't have any measurements, and so and even Rio de Janeiro did not have any measurements before we sent a $300 device. So I do think that we can actually do it cheaper than people expect, and actually we put a lot of pressure. What will the government do? And it's not a good idea. They'll say it's not as good as the air quality monitors of EPA certified. Nobody's saying that. What it is actually the Cali
It was mentioned yesterday in the panel that you can transform basically your cell phone into a monitoring device. So it would be really cool that we upload this information, right? Like it's a way to really have the information in our hands, literally, and just being able to provide that to the community. So I encourage you all to just give it a look and try to promote this.
Please, Jonathan.
And I can, since this was mentioned, the U.S. does have air quality monitors at many of our embassies around the world. I think it's something like 135 embassies or consulates have PM2.5 monitors. But we recently started also adding ozone monitors to some. So there's something like 65 now that have ozone monitors, which in many cases the only ozone monitor, surface ozone monitor in the city, or in the region at all. So we're very excited about that, and that is expanding. But it's really also an issue of awareness in that a lot of the posts that the embassies will think they have a PM2.5 monitor and they think they've covered all of air quality, even if they don't really, it's more of an ozone problem than a PM problem in their area. And that's because, again, the ozone hasn't been as prevalent. And so it is something that people are starting to come to us with our embassies and say, hey, what is this ozone thing? Is that a problem for our area? Is that a problem for our city? And then we'll have to look it up and say, well, for your embassy, maybe it doesn't matter so much, but for yours, oh, this could matter a lot, and you should get one. We were also very excited that this past summer, NASA announced, jointly with the State Department, the deployment of 10 what's called Pandora boxes, which are machines that can measure the column tropospheric ozone above a city. And so the U.S. is making efforts to expand ozone monitoring and help bring access to areas which don't have it, which we again help provide technical assistance to local regions where we have this monitoring infrastructure in place to then expand this and bring more information to areas where it have observation gaps.
Okay, so we're getting to the end of our session, our panel. So I would like to thank Jane, Jonathan, Marcelo, Zitely. Thank you all very much. If we can give them a hand. And of course, as we have heard, there are great challenges, but also great opportunities. So we need to move forward, take action, and keep up the good work. So thank you very much to all of you. Thank you for all of you being here today. Thank you.